Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Wednesday, July 8th, 2026. I'm your host, Eric White, filling in for Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up this hour of the Federal Drive, many pointed to the policy issues with the proposed NDAs the Trump administration wants federal employees to sign, but what about the constitutional factors? Plus, NIST's National Vulnerability Database has largely been a helpful resource, but needs some help to continue that. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Last year, hundreds of Department of Homeland Security employees were reassigned to different jobs. Some were shifted over to Immigration and Customs Enforcement to bolster the Trump administration's immigration crackdown. Now the DHS Inspector General is looking at whether those reassignments were done legally. For more, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me. Justin, happy to hear from you.
Good to be with you, Eric.
What exactly is the DHS IG's office going to consider here?
Well, the DHS Inspector General has just issued a short notification to the DHS Chief Human Capital Officer that this month it will start looking into reassignments that occurred for senior executive service employees between January 25th, 2025 and March 24th, 2026. And that timeline aligns with Kristi Noem's tenure as Homeland Security Secretary before she was replaced by the current Secretary, Mark Wayne Mullen. And during Noem's time at DHS, there were a lot of employees who were shifted from jobs supporting cybersecurity or disaster response over to seemingly completely disparate jobs, and in some cases supporting ICE and the buildup of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And so this review will look at whether those reassignments were conducted in accordance with federal laws, regulations, and policies. That's what DHS Inspector General Joseph Kafari wrote in this short notice. Beyond that, we don't really know a lot about what exactly the DHS IG will be looking at here, but what we do know is that these reassignment notices went out in kind of different spurts over the course of Noem's tenure. They were somewhat controversial, and now a lot of them have actually been rescinded. And so this is very much a backward-looking review.
You mentioned the leadership change that has occurred since these reassignments were done. How did they play out under former Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem?
Yeah, it was interesting. As I mentioned, it happened in spurts, and one of those big periods for these management-directed reassignments, as they're known in federal parlance, was last fall. Between about August and October, there were at least dozens of DHS employees who were sent these MDRs. In the cases that we reported on, staff received short notice reassignments hundreds of miles away from their existing duty station, in some cases to fill jobs that were completely outside their area of expertise. And so there was speculation that this wasn't just to kind of beef up the immigration enforcement surge, but it was also a way of perhaps forcing employees out, because as we know, last year there was an effort to really cull the federal government. And in this case, where the DHS IG is looking at the senior executive service, of course, there was a lot of turnover among the senior ranks as well.
Speaking here with Federal News Network reporter Justin Doubleday, what did the employees themselves have to say about these reassignments? We're doing a lot of talking without getting a word in from them yet.
Yeah, well, some employees I spoke to at the time last October said that, this came out of left field and that they felt that this was kind of a way to get them to potentially resign from their position, because the thing about a management-directed reassignment is that if you don't accept it, then the federal agency can start to terminate your position because they are, in effect, mandatory. I spoke with some lawyers as well who represent federal employees in cases like this, and they said, that their clients felt that some of these management-directed reassignments were reprisal for reporting misconduct or refusing to carry out what they felt was an illegal order. And so that was definitely one of the kind of sort of things about these reassignments was it felt for some folks like it was a punishment for not necessarily falling in line with the new Trump administration specifically and what they were looking to do at DHS.
When you say a legal order, what are the rules around how agencies reassign employees? We're not talking about from one department to another. We're talking about another Homeland Security entity from one of those to another. So I imagine they're a little bit different.
Well, there's actually a lot of flexibility for agencies to carry out these reassignments. The civil service regulations that govern reassignments give agencies extensive flexibility to reassign an employee to a different position. There just has to be a, quote, legitimate organizational reason. And so you can come up with those in spades, I'm sure, very, very easily. But if there isn't something that people can point to, and especially if an employee was reassigned to a job that is completely outside of their area of expertise, lawyers told me that's where they might start to look if this was improper. And so that's something that the Inspector General might look at. And then for SESers, senior executive service employees specifically, that's what the IG's review is looking at again here. There are restrictions around involuntarily reassigning a career SES employee when there's new leadership that comes into the agency. The restrictions are about 120 days after the appointment of the head of an agency or within 120 days after the employee's most immediate supervisor is appointed, if they're a political supervisor, a political appointee. And so that's another thing that Joseph Kafari's review might look at here is whether that 120-day timeline was respected.
When the report comes out, what is going to be the first thing that you look for in that executive summary?
Well, I think certainly looking at kind of the two dueling threads we've been talking about here. One, how much of these reassignments were really aimed at beefing up the kind of immigration crackdown that the Trump administration has been undertaking. There was certainly reports that, FEMA employees, for instance, were shifted over to ICE. And that could be, considered a legitimate business purpose, even if they disagreed with it. But then the other side of the coin is what we've been talking about around potential reprisals and how some employees are alleging that these reassignments were essentially punishment and a way to potentially force them out for not kind of being in line with the Trump administration's edicts. And so that will be interesting to see what avenues this report goes down to that degree and whether we find out whether this was kind of a way to punish people.
Federal News Network reporter Justin Doubleday, we will certainly have you on again once that report does come out. Thank you for filling us in.
Sounds good. Thanks, Eric.
And you can find more of Justin's reporting on this topic at federalnewsnetwork.com. Still to come, NIST's National Vulnerability Database has largely been a helpful resource, but now it needs some help to continue that. It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High-Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure, cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure, serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. A list of potential cyber vulnerabilities, rightfully called the National Vulnerability Database, is one of the many ways the National Institute of Standards and Technology aims to help industry and government cyber officials keep track of possible weaknesses in IT systems. However, a recent review of the NVD by the Commerce Department's Inspector General found that a backlog has developed over the years, and NIST officials are in need of more resources to cut it down. For an explanation of what it will take, I had the chance to speak with Chuck Mitchell from the IG's office.
The National Vulnerability Database is a critical piece of the nation's cybersecurity infrastructure. It's used by NIST to capture publicly reported vulnerabilities that they then add some important data to make available to defenders so that they can take action when vulnerabilities are identified, and then they can do the fixes that they need to in their own systems. It gets about 300,000 hits a day and is available worldwide, really.
And it's filled with folks that are on the front lines that are sending it to NIST, or does NIST also go out and look for these vulnerabilities itself as well?
Yeah, really, they're a downstream user of all the vulnerability ecosystem. So there's this other database called the CVE database that is managed by MITRE and the Department of Homeland Security. NIST gets a copy of that. They download it approximately hourly, and then that's where they start. That's kind of their starting point.
Gotcha. Okay. And then with that national vulnerability database, this is sort of a be on the lookout for those that are the defenders. Without getting too technical in the cybersecurity front, what does that look like? I mean, is that, a certain program that they should be analyzing, or is it a certain method of hackers trying to infiltrate? What do they see when they look at the NVD itself?
Yeah, there's really two primary ways that users interact with it. First is a public web page. So you can go there and you can say, I have this piece of software. Tell me all the vulnerabilities that exist there. And then the other way is really for machines to talk to other machines. So a application can go out, download all of the vulnerabilities, and then it can use that information to search throughout the defender's environment to identify anything that would be vulnerable to that.
Okay, using that helps them secure up their product and their networks and everything else of that nature, or what are they using it for exactly then?
Yeah, exactly. So one of the key pieces of information that NIST adds to vulnerabilities is a way to tie a piece of software to the vulnerable version. So let's say you've got a version of Windows and you want to know, is this specific version vulnerable? And if so, to what? That allows them to make that tie, and then they can take action on those specific pieces of software.
Okay, so this is an important piece of material here that NIST has its hand on, and you all wanted to take a look at how it is managing that. First off, what sparked this investigation itself, and then we can kind of get into the how and what you found.
Yeah, so back in 2024, a backlog started to develop. So as I mentioned, NIST gets public vulnerability reports and adds critical information to that. They were falling behind in that processing, and so this backlog was growing. About a year later, the backlog still existed, and we wanted to know what was going on, why had it grown in that amount of time, and what was NIST going to do to get out of that. We also wanted to know what were they going to do to make sure that it didn't happen again once they were out of it. And so we decided to spin up this evaluation to see and really dig down in to understand the fundamentals of how they manage this.
All right. And you just made this easy by me being able to repeat all the questions you just asked yourself. What was it that you found in trying to answer those questions?
Yeah. So the most important thing that we found was really that this backlog was going to exist forever unless NIST made some significant changes. They really weren't able to keep up with the substantial growth that had happened in vulnerability reports. And at the same time, they were missing deadlines that they were setting for themselves on how to resolve this. And so really from the beginning in 2024 all the way through the end of our evaluation in 2026, the backlog had grown from 0 all the way up to about 27,000. And it was still growing by the time we finished our work.
And when you say the backlog, you mean reported vulnerabilities that just hadn't been confirmed yet or hadn't been added to the list? What do you mean when you say a backlog?
Yeah, exactly. So NIST gets the report, and think of it as kind of raw data. And what they do is they go and they look at each one of those. They add 4 pieces of critical information. And then once that's added, they publish it out for people to use. So until that actually happens, until they can go in and take a look at that and publish it, it's just kind of sitting in a queue, and there isn't a lot of visibility, and people can't use it for what they're trying to do on the defender side.
We're speaking with Chuck Mitchell. He's the Director for Cybersecurity Audits and Evaluations at the Department of Commerce Office of Inspector General. And how did they, in the folks that you spoke with and your own findings, what is the reason for this backlog occurring? What was the main thing? Was it workforce related, money related? What were you all thinking?
Well, the thing that really kicked off a lot of the backlog, the early on stuff from early 2024, was they had a contractor that does most of the work for this. So there's a bunch of analysts in this contract. It expired, and they didn't quickly enough re-award it to a new awardee so that they could pick up the work and that there wasn't a break in service there. So that's what started the backlog. At that point, once they had the new contract awarded, that the contractor came in, started working through all these vulnerabilities, but there just really wasn't enough resources available to make this happen in a short amount of time. And ultimately, because the processes were inefficient, which is one of the other things that we found, they just continuously fell behind there.
And let's talk about this from the other side, the folks that are actually giving this information to NIST. I imagine there was some frustration when they're trying to say, hey, this vulnerability is there. Will you please get it out into the world? Let everyone else know.
Yeah, and that's another one of the things that kind of sparked our evaluation here was there was an open letter published about 50 people in industry to both NIST and Congress that said, hey, there's this important thing over here that NIST does. They have a backlog. It's not getting better. We need some communication on what's going on here. We need to use this for our systems, and this is causing us problems. So we need more information from you about what's going on here, when's it going to be resolved, and when can we reestablish that trust in the National Vulnerability Database.
And I'm curious, going back to the start of the use of this program, is it a victim of its own success, kind of like the Cash for Clunkers program, where it was never intended to be used this widely, or they didn't think that this many people would be submitting so much information all the time, or did they know that this was coming and this is just a simple drop of the ball of not having enough resources behind it?
Well, it's been kind of growing organically since way back in the late 90s. So in one form or another, it started in like 1999, then became more formal in the early 2000s and has since grown. One of the things that's interesting about this program is NIST doesn't really control the other side of it, meaning they don't know what vulnerabilities are going to be reported. So any vulnerability out there that gets reported, they're kind of on the hook to do this data gathering and adding to each vulnerability report. So unfortunately, as that grows and as people get better at finding this stuff and reporting it out to the public, NIST now has to go in and take action.
All right, so let's get into recommendations here. What else can NIST do here to improve efficiency and get that backlog down?
Yeah, one of the things I mentioned is that they're part of this whole vulnerability ecosystem. And so one of the things we recommended to them was create a strategic plan, recognize where NIST fits in this overall ecosystem, and then play to the strengths of that particular aspect of it. So that's the first one. The second one we wanted to see was create a real backlog management plan that is achievable, that you can communicate out to people of when this will be resolved and how it will be resolved. And then finally, as I mentioned, it's kind of this situation where people were looking at this like, hey, this is critical. We want to know information about what's going on when this is going to happen. And so we recommended that they make a good communication strategy to get that information out, to be more communicative to the people that are actually using this day to day.
And I can't imagine there was much disagreement from them, since all of those things sound like it would just make the job easier down the road anyway.
No, and they agreed with all of those recommendations. And in a lot of cases, they actually, before our final report even came out, they had announced that they were making some changes.
Gotcha. Okay. And let's just talk today. This report came out, a couple of months ago. Are you already starting to see any improvement? Is it too early to call? And are you going to keep on a tally of how big the backlog gets in the future?
Yeah, we are kind of keeping an eye on it in the background. One of the things that NIST is required to give us 60 days after the final report is a corrective action plan. So we're awaiting to see that of like what they're formally going to do here. As I mentioned, they've already taken some action, and so we've been keeping an eye on that. And it does look like it is having an effect. Unfortunately, they didn't resolve the backlog per se. They rather just deferred it and said, we're not going to do that. We're going to use this other process where we have a prioritization method in place to take action on the things that are really important that are going to be affecting defenders. And so rather than waste our time on doing everything, we're going to look at the really critical stuff and get those done now.
Chuck Mitchell is Director for Cybersecurity Audits and Evaluations for the Commerce Department's Office of Inspector General. You can find this interview along with a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Still to come, some federal careers are built to end early, and that changes everything about how you plan the rest of your life. But first, many pointed to the policy issues with the proposed NDAs the Trump administration wants federal employees to sign. But what about the constitutional factors? It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. Back on the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton here on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. The Office of Personnel Management's proposal to institute a standardized NDA that federal workers could be required to sign as a condition of employment has made for much discussion in federal workforce circles. While many are concerned with the chilling effect it could have on workers, some are wondering about the possible violations of First Amendment rights. One of them is the organization Protect Democracy, which filed comments of its own opposing the measure. To get a read on its view, I spoke with Jules Torty, who is counsel for the organization.
I mean, my first reaction was that this looks like a prior restraint in violation of the First Amendment, which the Supreme Court has said is one of the worst types of First Amendment violations. My second thought was, doesn't this interact with existing whistleblower protections in a way that is really inconsistent with the law? And of course, my third was, this is just fantastically bad policy from a kind of normative perspective.
Gotcha. Okay. And so, let's break those down, from the First Amendment rights perspective, taking it outside of being a federal agency doing this to its employees. What rights do folks have? I mean, the First Amendment usually is one of the most sacred ones that people cite in the Bill of Rights. What standpoint do NDAs have for covering and hindering any of those First Amendment rights? Like I said, whether it's a federal agency or a large corporation that you're working for.
Well, Eric, I think you have it exactly right in terms of the primacy of the First Amendment. The First Amendment is quite literally at the top of the Bill of Rights. It was considered by the founders to be one of the most important protections, not only for individual liberty, but to protect the fragile democracy that they were building. But I do think that it's important to look at federal employees as distinct from just kind of regular private sector employees for the purposes of the First Amendment here. And that's because there are some restrictions that the Supreme Court has said the federal government can put on federal employees. But they have been clear throughout recent history that federal employees can speak out on matters of public concern. They have those clearly established First Amendment rights. Of course, it can't be, on the clock. It can't be using government devices or property or things like that. But the core right remains the same. If there's a matter of public concern, just because you're a federal employee, it doesn't mean that you can't speak out against it. And that right is really what these proposed NDAs would curtail. And that honestly is going to be different in the private sector. So, and I wouldn't really be able to speak to exactly what the limits are in the private sector. There's differences for industries and things like that. But what we do know is that it violates the First Amendment rights of federal employees if implemented.
Gotcha. Okay. And then going into whistleblower protections, whistleblower advocates will tell you it doesn't matter who's in the White House, that whistleblower rights have been trending in the wrong direction. And this would probably be another step down, I imagine, in their eyes. What whistleblower protections could come into play here if this policy is enacted? Because whistleblower protections are supposed to even supersede NDAs, because you're supposed to be pointing out something that would negate the NDA because a possible crime or putting people in danger, something else is at play. What would they have to say about this?
So Congress has repeatedly protected federal employees' ability to speak up about things like fraud, waste, and abuse. And again, that's not really for the protection of the federal employee as much as it is that we need to know what's happening within our government in order for it to function properly and in order for Congress to play any sort of meaningful oversight role about what the federal government is doing. And so the Whistleblower Protection Act says that you can disclose fraud, waste, and abuse to Congress and to the public. And the NDA requirement would really flip that law on its head. The NDA, as proposed by OPM, would require that disclosures be affirmatively pre-authorized by a small group of people. So it's before you spoke out, you'd have to get authorization from someone in the government, maybe even the same people you're trying to report for fraud, waste, and abuse. Whistleblower law now protects that right without any sort of pre-authorization. So instead of you can disclose unless a law specifically forbids it, which is the actual law right now, the practical effect becomes you can't disclose unless someone approves it first. And that's just directly at odds with Congress, what Congress intended and with what Congress wrote.
Jules Torty is counsel with Protect Democracy. And let's get into the policy standpoint of it, because once again, whether or not you agree with the idea or not, I imagine that this is going to be tied up in courts for so long that it may not even get to be implemented. As a counsel, I'm asking you to, I know, speculate a lot on a lot of the details, but you don't foresee this going down easily, right? I mean, there are going to be tons and tons of suits brought for A, employees that are current and don't want to sign it, or B, prospective employees who say, they get a job offer, but they have to sign this and then they're turned down. That could end up in court as well, no?
Any of those things could end up in court. I will say the state of federal employee litigation is in flux right now, and it's really hard to predict exactly what sorts of cases will really be meaningfully heard by a court or an adjudicative body and what won't. So traditionally, employee suits around personnel matters have been heard by the Merit System Protection Board, which was a neutral board of commissioners who enjoyed protection from removal by the president, and that adjudicated employee disputes, many of them. And in fact, the courts found that Congress had established this kind of special tribunal as the exclusive remedy for some of federal employees' employment-related disputes. And so they wouldn't touch them. They said, you can't come into federal court. You have to go over to the MSPB, the Merit Systems Protection Board. Now, of course, President Trump fired members, at least one member of the Merit Systems Protection Board. And recently in the Slaughter case, the Supreme Court upheld the president's firing of commissioners of formerly independent agencies, saying that he has the constitutional power to remove those commissioners. And so I know we kind of took a detour here into Supreme Court case law, but it has really seismic effects on what federal employment litigation looks like. So you're absolutely right, Eric. 2 years ago, I would have said, of course, there's going to be a ton of employees running in and saying, this violates my First Amendment rights. I can't be forced to sign this. This is inconsistent with other obligations. And there would have been a venue for them. I'm not so certain about whether federal employees have a meaningful, neutral venue right now. And I think we're going to increasingly see federal employees turning to the federal courts and saying that somebody needs to adjudicate their disputes, especially here where they're constitutional in nature. Eric, you kind of said there's no way this is going to roll out, right? Like it'll be challenged in court. And I just want to kind of clarify some kind of maybe a misconception from outside the legal world, which is that nothing really happens until a court says yes. In fact, things happen and they keep happening until a court says no. And that can take time. Our judicial system does not work quickly. And so legal challenges are one strategy to push back on illegality by this administration, but they're really not the only, and sometimes they're not the most effective. They're certainly not the quickest in many circumstances.
Gotcha. That's interesting because that kind of takes away from what my next question was going to be, which was if, say, an administration, whether it's the current one or a future one, if they are really trying to protect information and stop folks from running out and talking to the press or organizations like yourself, is there any avenue that they have that, in your eyes, would be legal and not violating their First Amendment rights? Or is that kind of just they're going to have to accept that there are always going to be whistleblowers and leaks that they're not going to approve of, and that's just kind of the cost of doing business?
That's such an interesting question because there are already many protections about information within the federal government that isn't allowed to leave. There is sensitive national security related information, and there are statutes that govern when that can be disclosed and when that can't. There are internal deliberations that often can't be disclosed. There are state secrets. There's a bunch of both laws that Congress has passed and doctrines that the courts have developed to shield a lot of information within the federal government from public view. If you've ever filed a FOIA request and gotten a response from the government, I will say I used to be one of those government attorneys, helping agencies send those responses to FOIA requests in some circumstances. There's a long list of reasons the federal government can point to say, no, we don't have to disclose that. Maybe there's an active investigation going on. Maybe it's something else. So what we at Protect Democracy, along with our colleagues at that Democracy Forward tried to articulate in our letter to OPM about this proposal is that there are already sufficient protections, statutory, regulatory, judicial protections against a lot of information leaving the federal government. And in fact, OPM actually seems to acknowledge this. OPM says in their proposal, this does not create any new legal obligations. This is just to let federal employees know about their obligations and make them promise. So it's puzzling in that way. We can talk more about why I don't actually think it's puzzling. They are proposing this really dramatic, really restrictive NDA that they themselves say actually doesn't really do anything. And so then the next question for me is, well, why are they proposing it? And that's where I think kind of an interesting conversation can happen.
Yeah, I think we'll let our listeners discern for themselves and read the tea leaves on why exactly that this is being implemented at all. But I appreciate you filling us in with the legal insight. I wanted to finish up here by just talking a little bit about your work with Protect Democracy and the Civil Service Archive. I know that I'm probably not giving it its due time in asking you to tell me in a short answer of what you're doing there, but if you could try, I would appreciate it.
Absolutely. So the Civil Service Archive is an online repository of all policy changes that are internal to the government, that change how your government works. Oftentimes this stuff is wonky. It's not public, or it's technically public but isn't posted anywhere. Even if it is, it's written in really technical language. And so what the Civil Service Archive tries to do is break down, what are these changes? What do they mean? And that's at civilservicearchive.org. We've tagged everything. We've tagged stuff that's related to each other. You can see trends, you can see connections. And then the other resource I'd commend to readers is our Substack called Dear Civil Servant, which is part of our Protect Democracy's If You Can Keep It Substack, where we try to take big changes to the civil service and break them down plain language, make them accessible. And so both of those resources, I think, could be really useful to your listeners.
Jules Tordy is counsel for Protect Democracy. Find this interview at our website. Head to federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. You can also subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, some federal careers are built to end early, and that changes everything about how you plan the rest of your life. It's the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry. For law enforcement officers and others, retirement can come in the late 40s or 50s with decades still ahead to fund and plan. That shift changes how they think about saving, second careers, and long-term risks. Joining the Federal Drive earlier to discuss the mind and investment shift required, federal retirement expert Tammy Flanagan.
Usually when you and I talk about retirement planning, we're talking about the average Fed who has a pretty long runway. Today, we're going to talk about a special group of people, those around and affiliated with law enforcement careers. The federal government's really had a focus on increasing hiring there. They've had hiring incentives. They've been focused on pay raises, but I suspect a lot of people at that point aren't really thinking about retirement. So there's some interesting provisions here. Let's start with those. What is it about these that is different from the average federal career?
Well, the main difference is they carry a gun and a badge. So because of that requirement that requires a young and vigorous workforce, as we used to say back in the day, it has the benefit of a more generous retirement benefit, but also an earlier retirement. In fact, people that are serving in these positions, they're subject to mandatory retirement, which is unusual because most federal employees, we meet employees every day in their 70s and beyond, and it's not a problem. But in law enforcement, typically, you've got to retire by the time you're 57. And sometimes that's hard because they really love that career for most part, and that's their identity. So leaving that early sometimes can be a tough transition, not only financially, but also emotionally.
You were just working with some probation officers. What stood out to you about how early retirement changes their decisions?
Well, first of all, there's kind of two ways to look at early retirement for these law enforcement groups. They're pretty marketable on the outside world, so they can become, security folks for, diplomats or dignitaries or CEOs of organizations. So some of them look into second careers kind of in the same line of work. And that's a whole different way to plan if you're going to have not only your retirement coming in plus a second pretty good salary. Other folks either want to fully retire or they want to retire and do something fun, maybe work at a golf course or, do something that's not going to make a ton of money, but totally stress-free since they just got out of a career that was high stress. So if you're in the group that wants to have that second career, then you want to get out as soon as you can. And for law enforcement officers, that usually means any age if you've got 25 years of service. So I've seen some folks retire as early as 46. Or if you don't have the 25 years, then you got to retire at 50 and have at least 20 years in that covered law enforcement position. So the reason why I say get out as soon as you can is because, number one, you're more marketable at 45 or 50 than you are at 57. And you have more time to spend in that second career. And you already got your lifetime health insurance. So you can go to that new employer and say, hey, we don't need health insurance. I just need, the salary. So that's the one group. The other group who works until they can afford to retire, sometimes they still retire fairly young, and other times they'll stay until they're mandatory just to max out those benefits. Get as much time as they can in the TSP, get more years of service into that retirement benefit. So if they started, let's say at age 22 and they work until they're 57, well, heck, they're going to still have 35 years of service, which is a full career by any standard. But I think the one thing they sometimes don't pay enough attention to in some cases because they are so involved in the job that they're doing that has long hours, they're all over the place, they're not sitting behind a desk all the time, is that they need to understand early on, more so than everybody else perhaps, how important those retirement savings are in the thrift savings plan and managing that account so that you're not too conservative and have room there for growth.
Tammy Flanagan is a principal with Retire Federal. Tammy, I identify with this a little bit. I was 41 when I retired from the military. And obviously I have failed at retirement many times. But for someone who is stepping away from that federal career in their mid-40s, early 50s, what does their financial reality really look like? And what especially should they be thinking about in the TSP?
Well, in the TSP, I've heard a lot of them tell me, boy, I wish I would have had that Roth option early on because, taking money out of the TSP early on and paying tax on that on top of your regular retirement, that kind of takes a little bit out of what you've saved. So the Roth option can be very important to those folks, especially because they've got half their lifetime perhaps ahead of them. So that's a long time to make that TSP account last. And then the other thing I hear some regrets about is being too safe. Either they've stuck with the G fund for the most part, which is, as everybody seems to start to know these days, it's kind of dangerous because it's barely going to keep you ahead of inflation, not really going to be a good investment as your whole portfolio. So trying to get out of that G fund into the stock market a little bit more, I think is important for those folks to maximize their growth potential. There's no guarantee, as all financial planners say, there's past performance doesn't guarantee future returns, but history has shown that the stock market's going to do something for your investment so that you can have that compound growth and maybe perhaps be able to retire quite comfortably at a young age.
And you do make a point there with extended life expectancy. These early retirements really are going to have a long time frame to make those withdrawals last, not just 20 years, maybe 40 years or longer.
That's right. So that's why I think a lot of folks will maybe not work a full second career, but maybe something so they don't have to start tapping into those investments too early or too much. If you start taking out 7 or 8% when you're 45, you'll be out of money by the time you qualify for Social Security. And also I would add to the benefits of this career is that they get cost of living adjustments right away, where most FERS retirees have to wait till they're 62. For law enforcement and other special groups that fall into these special provisions, they can get their COLAs right away. They get their supplement from FERS that that Social Security bridge payment. They get that, but it's not tested for outside earnings until they're 57 or at their minimum retirement age. So therefore, if they go out at 45, they can work another 12 years without worrying about losing that supplement. So that helps them too.
That's really important. One of the more complicated decisions here might be survivor benefits. What makes that planning so difficult when someone is retiring at a relatively young age?
Yeah, because if you're married at the time you retire, but you're only 50 years old and your spouse might be the same or maybe even a little younger, you're thinking in terms of, boy, if I have to take this 10% reduction for the rest of my life off of this benefit, that's a lot of money over all that time. And there's a good chance, hopefully, that we both live well into our later years, and the person who's going to receive the benefit might only get it for a couple of years. So I end up seeing more folks doing the partial survivor benefit to protect the health insurance for their spouse, and then maybe looking at other options to protect their spouse financially, maybe a more generous life insurance benefit or some other type of investment that's going to allow them to still live comfortably financially, no matter what time of the year or lifetime I might leave the earth, but still not be that much of a financial commitment. And that's hard for me to say, as you can tell, because I'm a real fan of the survivor benefit, being a spouse myself of a federal employee. But I do think that they tend to look at other alternatives more frequently than other retirees do.
And what does that mean then for the working law enforcement person here in terms of planning for the rest of their earnings potential life after retirement? What do they need to think about in terms of keeping things in balance, keeping eligibility, and managing withdrawals overall?
For financial planning purposes, as they retire early and they're trying to stretch everything out over a longer lifetime period, they've got to think in terms of, still investing for the future, because not only does this money have to last, 10 or 20 years, it might have to last 30 or 40 years. And maybe because I'm retiring younger, it might be important for me to buy that long-term care insurance because I can get it at a pretty inexpensive rate at a younger age. And that way, if something does happen down the road that either me or my spouse needs that type of custodial care or personal care, I'm not going to deplete my savings over it, which might already be partially depleted by that point as well. But of course, those who work that second career, the one catch there is that sometimes when you have your retirement that could be $30,000, $40,000 a year, plus another $150,000 a year or more in that second career, you tend to start to expand your lifestyle. And that's the one caution. I hear a lot of financial planners warn folks who retire early into that second career to still plan for that future when all of that's going to end and you're just going to have the retirement benefit. So if you don't want to work for the rest of your life, then you might want to start to live more within the means of what your future retirement is going to look like.
Tammy Flanagan is a principal with Retire Federal. We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on demand wherever you get your podcasts. The Defense Department significantly reduced the size of its civilian workforce in 2025. The department, however, started shedding its employees prior to 2025. A government watchdog found that the Pentagon did not consistently analyze the impacts of these reductions either during the 2025 downsizing or in prior years. It also found the Pentagon has no plan to assess lessons learned from its 2025 workforce reduction efforts. For more, Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis spoke with the Government Accountability Office's Director of Defense Capabilities and Management, Christy Williams.
Bottom line is we were looking at DoD's efforts to reduce the appropriated fund civilian workforce through two means, specifically through the planned budgeting process and then through the additional workforce reductions that were brought about in 2025. So you asked about specifically the 40 components that would have reduced their workforce from fiscals 23 to 2025. And so I'll just start by saying the 40 components that we looked at. So how we selected them was looking at the budget exhibits that were the best publicly available data with consistent information at the unclassified level. So there is some additional budget documentation through the Fiscal Year's Defense Program that would include some classified information, but we were looking for publicly available information for those program civilian workforce reductions. And if you look across the 3 fiscal years, overall about 22 of the 40 components did program some reductions. So we were seeing some reductions across the board. Of those components, so we did I think that the second part of your question was kind of drilling down into some of the reasons for the documentation, the analysis that was conducted. So we chose 14 components that from the 40 had relatively large year-over-year reductions. So we were looking more like 1% or more of their civilian workforce and 10 FTEs or more. So we wanted something where the expected analysis would really reflect some of those larger reductions and be particularly relevant. So of those 14 components that then we did a deeper dive into, there was a mixture. So 11 of the 14 did conduct some form of analysis to really inform their reduction efforts. There were 3 that didn't, and the reasons cited for not conducting some analysis, it was more focused on the nature of the programmed reduction. So some of the input and feedback that we got from the department is in cases where there wasn't an overall reduction in FTEs, so maybe it was a realignment or an adjustment from a prior cycle, that the analysis was not needed. So those were the cases cited for 3 of the components. There were 11 components that did conduct some analysis, and it varied, as you can see in the report. There was one component, the Missile Defense Agency, who provided documentation that touched on all 7 elements required by Section 129 AB. The others, they kind of ranged there. For example, I think we had around 6 of the components that touched on the element of military force structure and operational effectiveness, but only 2 that touched on issues of stress on the force and lethality. So it varied depending on the specific element of the 7. We got a range of responses as to why they might not have conducted the analysis or the full analysis. It ranged from things like decentralization. So maybe there was one office that looked at one part of an issue and another office that looked at another part, and the process was spread across multiple offices, and it just presented some challenges to the documentation. Also relevance. So for example, the Defense Finance Accounting Service basically doesn't, they said we don't assess lethality as part of our mission, so that one doesn't really apply to us. So it was the applicability of maybe the specific element to the component at hand. So some individual examples of why, but big picture, the reason that we got is a lack of department-wide guidance, not just on how to conduct the analysis, but when that analysis should be conducted. So the guidance might have some mentions and references, but it doesn't comprehensively address when that reduction should prompt the analysis.
What were some of the major findings, and what stood out to you in the process?
What we've touched on so far were the programmed reductions. I think some of the more significant findings came as we were looking at some of the reductions that were happening in real time, right? The analysis. So the department had beginning in 2025, the department, outside of the normal budgeting process, implemented several workforce reduction measures. So I'm sure you're tracking the government-wide deferred resignation program. There was the DoD deferred resignation program, termination of probationary employees, a hiring freeze. So a lot of this was happening in real time, and it was happening at the time we were collecting data and conducting our analysis. And I think, one of the things that stood out, and we highlighted this in the report, is that overall, DoD's civilian workforce decreased by just under 10% from January 1st, 2025 to January 1st, 2026. So that was quite a reduction to the civilian workforce. And I think this is particularly important because if you look big picture at the number of civilians that the department employs, I mean, we're talking I believe around January 2025, we're talking about 793,000 civilians. This decreased to about 771,000 around September 2025, but these civilians are carrying out some fundamental missions for the department, whether it be, caring for active duty soldiers and their dependents, managing weapon systems and facilities, providing logistics support. There's a range of activities. And so one of the interesting points that we found is kind of the impact of all of this. Like, what is the impact? And you'll note in the report we talk about some of the challenges that were identified over the course of the reductions. But I think one of the big picture challenges is probably both the loss of personnel and institutional knowledge in a short period of time that the department then had to either address or compensate for in some other way.
Let's talk about those reductions that took place in 2025. So the DoD in January 2025 started implementing all these efforts to reduce its civilian workforce, whether it's targeting the probationary employees or offering DRP or the deferred resignation program. So I think that in your report, the number is 53,000 applications that the Defense Department received for deferred resignations. How accurate is that number? Because I think we have a little bit of a higher number in terms of how many people left through the deferred resignation program. But then also, could you talk about, like you mentioned, officials reported some of the challenges while conducting some of that analysis. What were some of those challenges when trying to assess the impacts of these reductions?
So let me start with the data piece. So you mentioned, and yes, our data found that as of September 2025, there were approximately 53,200 applications for the DRPs. I will just note, and GAO has some additional work that has been published looking at federal government-wide workforce reductions. There could be differences in the data for a number of reasons. It could be because of the time periods covered. So I know, even internally, some of our work at GAO has covered different time periods. Types of employees included. So some reviews might exclude employees in a non-pay status, but we did not exclude those employees. It could be based on when data was obtained and ongoing changes to the data, because there were some cases where the department was trying to catch up with the data in their systems. So I think despite some of those differences in the time periods, the types of employees included, the types of data obtained, the data for the time period that we reflected in our report, we are confident reflects the data that was available at that point in time. I recognize there may be some differences as you look across different reporting, and I imagine at some point the systems will catch up and the data will be reflected kind of consistently. But those were some of the challenges that we experienced in collecting the data. In terms of, so I do want to caveat that our task was really focused on the analysis, the analysis in support of the federal law that requires this analysis be conducted. We were not really doing a deep dive into some of the challenges that were identified, but in some of our conversations, that was an inherent part of the conversation, right? What challenges were experienced, but also on the flip side, maybe some of the benefits that were experienced as a result of some of these changes. So, what I can share with you is basically what we reflected in our report. I don't have a lot of additional depth that I could offer in terms of benefits and challenges. The key areas of benefits, for example, would be just the opportunity to streamline and to optimize a workforce that has changed over time, and an opportunity to really restructure some of the operations that the department would be carrying out through these components. So it did provide that opportunity for some of the components as they were thinking about what their workforce looked like from a civilian perspective. But again, as I mentioned, there were a lot of changes happening in quick succession, and there wasn't a loss of institutional knowledge that might not otherwise have been lost during that time period, right? So you had an overall reduced workforce capacity, and that left some of the challenges that we identified is it left behind increasing workload pressures on those employees that were left behind. But it's also really hard to assess some of the impacts and challenges in activities that are underway and that are happening in quick succession. And that's where our recommendation was kind of coming in, is really looking holistically at the changes you're making to the workforce and really thinking about what lessons are you learning. So if you had to do this again, you would be able to position the department to be able to assume some of these challenges as you're going through such a significant change.
That's GAO's Director of Defense Capabilities and Management, Christy Williams, speaking with Federal News Network's Anastasia Obis. You can find her story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by me, Eric White, along with Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook and LinkedIn. I'm Eric White filling in for Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.